Hi, I'm Vikram, and I'll be presenting our paper, Save a Tree or 6 kilogram of CO2, Understanding Effective Carbon Footprint Interventions for Eco-Friendly Vehicular Choices. This work was done as part of my internship at Toyota Research Institute with my co-authors. As we all know, everyday activities ranging from using electrical appliances to riding vehicles contribute towards rising carbon emissions. But what if there was a way to measure environmental impact and you had green choices available? Which one would you choose? An action that reduces 270 pounds of carbon dioxide, an action that saves 2 trees, or one that saves 14 gallons of gasoline? Well, that's what we're going to find out in this paper. Standard energy metrics, such as pounds or grams of CO2 emitted, are either too scientific or they're just not actionable. For example, if I tell you that you just released 10 pounds of CO2, what can you do about it? Is it good? Is it bad? Can you lower it by 1 or 2 pounds? So the US EPA came up with a calculator that converts CO2 by weight into CO2 equivalencies, which are concrete terms that regular consumers might be familiar with, such as gasoline consumed or number of trees that need to be planted. In total, there are 22 such equivalencies on the EPA website. These emissions and equivalencies are all around us, be it flight bookings, Monroney stickers that come with cars in the US, or in supermarket aisles. Prior work in HCI has shown that providing such feedback on resource consumption can help consumers reduce their environmental impact. Some tools use green lifts to indicate an eco mode, some mention raw numbers, while others use polar bears or trees. But what is the right way to communicate carbon emissions information as eco-feedback? Sanguinetti et al. Proposed a framework for improving the effectiveness of eco-feedback information, where they broke it into different dimensions along granularity and messaging. While we explore all of these dimensions in the paper, in this talk, I'll largely focus on metrics, that is, what measurement units are being used. We specifically asked the following questions. Does CO2 information affect a consumer's choice? We thought no, but turned out to be yes. Does communicating in terms of equivalencies influence choice better than raw CO2 numbers? We thought yes, but found out that's not really the case. Does providing additional context help? We found that negative balance in the messaging and focusing on social information actually help. We investigated these questions in the personal transportation sector, which, according to a US EPA report in 2020, was the highest emitter of greenhouse gases. In this paper, we focused on two popular forms of commute, ride sharing, where user choices will have a short-term impact on the environment, and rentals, which have a longer-term impact on the environment. Plus, different ride-sharing and rental companies are already offering eco-friendly alternatives. So we were keen on finding what kind of information should these platforms provide for nudging users towards more eco-friendly choices. We conducted several online studies on Prolific with over 4,500 participants, where participants did different rental and ride-sharing tasks, and they had to choose between a green option and a regular option while being shown different interventions. The goal of the studies was to understand the influence of these interventions on the participants' choices. We conducted these studies in 2 phases. In phase 1, participants were shown a fictional ride-sharing app with a regular ride and an eco-friendly ride green, and the options varied by location, price, distance, and emissions. We augmented the ride options with different interventions such as raw CO2 numbers, CO2 equivalencies, and some additional interventions such as social framing and extrinsic rewards. For phase 2, we explored contextuality, where we looked at social influence, balance in the messaging, whether positive or negative, and providing additional explanations. Then we tested ambiguity, where we looked at relative versus absolute emission numbers and the role of emission targets. Finally, we looked at temporality, where we switched to a rental task and wanted to see whether emissions per day was more effective than emissions over entire duration. In this talk, I will just focus on these 3 studies along with phase 1. So let's dive into study one, where we looked at equivalencies versus raw CO2 emission numbers. Here, we tested these interventions in a ride-sharing context. We had a baseline condition where we showed the green ride with a simple green lift without any emissions info. And then we had these other interventions. So what did we find? We found that all interventions worked. All interventions improved upon the baseline. People were willing to pay more for the green option. But pounds of CO2 had the strongest influence on consumer choices. Almost all interventions increased the likelihood of choosing green option over the baseline. And with pounds of CO2, people were 3.7 times more likely to pick a green ride over the baseline. To summarize, we found that raw CO2 numbers were more effective than the equivalencies, which takes us to our second study, that is relative versus absolute CO2 emission numbers. We wanted to know whether people actually understood these raw CO2 numbers in absolute terms, or they can only act on it if shown in relative terms. We tested this in a study where we showed participants two different ride-sharing apps and varied three conditions. One, where no CO2 information was provided for either of the apps. Two, where CO2 information was provided for both the apps. And then finally, CO2 information was provided only for one of the apps. We first saw something that affirmed our previous finding, that is, when both options showed CO2 information, people picked the one with lower emissions. But when only one option had CO2 information available, people ended up picking that option, suggesting some kind of transparency effect towards emissions information. So people liked having CO2 information, but they don't really understand the CO2 values, as we did not see any effect for the magnitude of the emission values, like whether people were drawing any kind of mental threshold on these emission values. We didn't see any of that. When asked what a pound of CO2 means, we received a lot of I don't know and gibberish responses. So to summarize, while raw CO2 emissions are effective, people don't really understand absolute numbers and would rather use relative comparisons for making their decisions. Finally, we explored the impact of providing additional context. We focused on social framing. First, we took a particular equivalency and showed the collective impact of that equivalency. For example, how many gallons of gasoline or trees were saved because N people picked the green ride. We also test whether showing percentage of other people picking a green ride had any effect on people's choice. So what did we find? People responded well to the social information about collective emissions or savings. Collective impact worked better than popularity interventions and actually has a less chance of backfiring. Further, for certain equivalencies such as trees or bags of waste, we found that showing collective impact improved their effectiveness when compared to individual impact. Then we looked at balance to see whether it made a difference if the messaging was framed positively or negative. We found that negative framing increased the likelihood of picking a green ride for all of the equivalencies that we tested. To summarize, equivalencies did not outperform raw CO2 emissions, but people also don't understand absolute emission numbers. We also found that people responded well to additional context, such as collective impact and negatively framed messages. So in this talk, I only focused on these key findings. To learn about all of our other findings, please read our paper. Zooming out from these findings, in our paper, we focused on the information aspect of this eco-feedback framework and discussed metrics, valence, and behavioral granularity in this talk. Similarly, there are opportunities to explore the other aspects of this framework, such as where and when to display these interventions. Using the findings from our studies, certain interventions can also be embodied in different applications for encouraging eco-driving and charging behavior for electric vehicles. Going forward, our study also opens doors for exploring whether these equivalencies work well for every demographic group, or if these interventions can be extended to other domains beyond transportation. Further, our studies also highlight a major gap in carbon literacy and presents an opportunity for the HCI community to explore how we can bridge that gap. Well, in the end, CO2 information was the winner, which brings me to the end of my talk. I'd like to thank my co-authors and Toyota Research Institute for the opportunity to present this work.